right, hello everybody. I'm John Forcucci, and I'm here today with Todd Taylor, Senior Vice President of New York Life's retail annuities business. He's one of the authors, along with Kelly Faust, of Understanding Underspending in Retirement, the Decumulation Paradox. Boy, is that a mouthful, Todd. But welcome, first of all, and tell us what is the decumulation paradox?
Great. Well, thank you for having me, John. And maybe we need to consult you on our titling choices next time. Next time we do this. So the decumulation paradox. Let me answer this by sort of giving a little story. The decumulation paradox fundamentally is the misalignment between assumed behavior of retirees once they reach retirement and start living and spending in retirement, and what's observed. And specifically this idea that although people have saved all their lives, many people have saved all their lives for retirement with the idea of, living comfortably in retirement. In practice, we observe that many folks are actually not spending down their assets and continuing to hold on to assets in retirement. Hence this paradox of, sort of saving the money. The anecdote I wanted to share was, a few years ago, we stumbled onto this in the following way. We had done a survey of American consumers, mostly retirees, mostly generally affluent retirees. And we wanted to ask them essentially if they knew what a safe withdrawal rate was. Our intent was to demonstrate that despite all this research around the 4% rule, many people didn't actually know what a safe withdrawal rate was, whether it was 3 or 4 or whatever. And our research in fact, did support that. People generally didn't know what a safe withdrawal rate was. They gave us all kinds of crazy answers like 30 and 8 and 52. But the real aha in this was we subsequently, and I'm glad we did this, we asked them, okay, for those of you in retirement, what are you actually spending at? To sort of show that, in fact, they were actually overspending and they're running this risk of running out of money in retirement. And that was the real aha, because the conclusion was largely they weren't spending down at all. And we've subsequently done more research, which I can talk about, but it was this big aha that many of us in the industry have assumed people systematically withdraw at 4%, Bill Bengen's rule on this. And in practice, it demonstrated that most people weren't systematically spending down their assets at all. And that led to this whole body of work that we wrote about.
Yeah, and I wonder if it's been exacerbated recently by there's so many factors. People are afraid of outliving their money as we age, older and healthier now. Obviously, we've had some rocky economic times and high inflation. So I think there a fear factor here that adds to that?
Absolutely. And I think, you've probably hit the nail right on the head there. Bill Sharp, the Nobel laureate, had this quote that said that, decumulation or, spending money in retirement was what he called the hardest problem in finance. And I think he comes at this obviously from a very mathematical lens, but there's a lot of, to put it in math terms, a lot of variables. There's the rate of spend down. There's obviously the return on your investments. There's how long you're going to live. There's inflation. There's various different types of inflation. And so that whole confluence of factors, to your point, makes this a very difficult problem. Now, if you're a Nobel laureate and you can't figure this out, imagine if you're, an everyday investor. And, a little bit of this has been, we're an annuity company. For years, we've been highlighting that one of the values of plain old basic annuities is protecting you from, if you live a long time, the annuity continues to pay out. And so for years, we marketed the products almost with that fear factor of, you may run out of money, you need this protection. And I think we and others have probably done a very good job successfully convincing people that spending down in retirement is complex and multivariate. And as a result, exactly as you highlight, I think in the face of complexity, perhaps even more complex in today's environment with all the uncertainties of the market, many have taken a conservative approach, which is just let me hold on to what I have, let me spend at a much lower rate. And it's in some ways a form of sort of self-insuring your own retirement. But at the least, it's, to your point, avoiding all of that complexity.
So what's the problem with that? Why does it matter that people aren't spending as much as they might? Why is that an issue?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a great question. And I'll use this example. So I've studied and written about retirement for the better part of the last 10 or 15 years, much of it based on modeling spend down strategies, et cetera. And I had a sort of an anecdotal moment a few years ago where I asked my then, I think she was 93-year-old grandmother, essentially what, she'd been living in retirement for 40 years or 35 years. And I asked her basically some version of like, what's your spend down strategy or what's your retirement strategy? Now, first, she looked at me like I had three heads, like what I was bothering her about. But once we got past why I was asking her these questions, she essentially said some version of I don't spend down. Like, we figure out how much money comes in every month. And then I spend a little bit less than that. And I guarantee that I won't run out of money that way, or virtually guarantee. And the point of that, to your question is what that means is she ended up leaving when she passed a bequest onto our family. Now, this was modest. It wasn't a significant windfall, but it effectively was money that we didn't need and she didn't really want to give to us. What she really wanted to do was to enjoy her retirement for those prior 35 years. And this isn't just my grandmother. There's consistent research on this. We mentioned a study from the Insured Retirement Institute in our paper. But very consistently, if you ask retirees, what are your top goals? It's usually the number one is live comfortably in retirement. And just about the last one is something along the lines of leave a bequest or leave money to my heirs. And by underspending, effectively what people are doing is leaving money to their heirs, which, to put it in economic terms, is not maximizing utility. They want to spend money. They're not. In practice, they're doing what they don't want to do, which is hold on to that money. And so that's really the problem and somewhat of the paradox as well.
Yeah, we've been reading and seeing a lot about people unretiring recently. And in some cases, it's they're worried about money and, that sort of thing. But in other cases, they're bored. And, they regret leaving their job behind, the camaraderie of working with people, that sort of thing. And people are healthier longer and want to be active longer. It's not the old days where you're going to retire and sit in a rocking chair. You're going to pursue your interests. So there's also that component of funding a lifestyle that maximizes a retirement to the full potential of it. And I think that is becoming kind of more important maybe than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So I think that's another reason why not being afraid to spend money that you actually have and can and spend relatively safely can improve quality of life.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, we this is not a topic we got into in any great detail. We really focused on purely the kind of the spending strategy side of this, but there is a lot of research, to your point, on the value of staying active later into retirement, whether it's going back to work in some form, volunteering, et cetera. And you're right, that makes the point on being able to enjoy yourself while you're doing that financially even more important.
And I believe in the research in your study, you talk a little bit about people self-insuring, and kind of looking at it that way. So tell me a little bit about that and also the behavioral biases, what's the thinking here of
Yeah,
folks?
absolutely. So let me take the second question first. I think the what's causing this is we could debate whether this is rational or irrational. In some ways, if your goals are to spend money and your goals are not to leave a bequest, it's irrational to hold on to all this money that you end up leaving to others. However, to your point earlier, there is an awful lot of complexity, and it's not like a math problem in typical terms. And so the uncertainty, perhaps in a rational way, you hold on to assets in the event that you need a new roof, or you end up, in a nursing home, or you have some kind of major medical expense or whatever. But that leads to this question on self-insuring, because what that means, if folks are doing this rationally, and it's not some kind of behavioral bias, like, they're anchoring to their level of savings, or they've got a loss aversion against losing off of that value or something like that. But if we say it's rational, what folks are really doing is that they are holding on to a lot of assets for low probability but high impact events later in their life, like ending up in a nursing home, like living to be 105, like having your roof fall in. And what's interesting about that is in all the other aspects of our lives, especially before you retire, we have a good solution for that, and it's insurance. It's the fundamental purpose of insurance. So my family, I have two little kids. That's the drawings behind me. We moved to the suburbs about a year and a half ago, and we bought homeowners insurance because we wanted to insure the value of our home. Now, I'm not trying to win against my property and casualty insurer and get a good return on that. In fact, I obviously don't want to do that. What I'm doing is I don't want to hold the entire value of my house in cash in case it burns down. That's really, really inefficient. So that low probability event is protected very nicely by my homeowner's insurance. And this is really what sort of we found in a lot of the data on this self-insuring behavior is that, interestingly, the people who had some form of guarantee associated with the retirement. Now, the greatest example of this is having a defined benefit pension. So Vanguard did this study a few years ago. We mentioned this in our paper. They basically broke people into the sources of their income in retirement. Basically, how many people, the largest group of people who were having money come from their brokerage accounts, from their DC plans, from their DB plans, et cetera. And then they controlled for other factors, like controlled for overall wealth and affluence and age and everything else. And what they found was that those who had the pensions, holding everything else equal, spent more in retirement. And that's basically demonstrating that the others, to some degree, were doing a form of self-insurance against, living a long time or having something turn bad in their portfolio. And interestingly, we found this held in a bunch of other examples. Ebrey did this study showing that owners of long-term care insurance, so a big, low probability, high impact event late in life, as you could end up needing care late in life. Ebrey found that those who had long-term care insurance, again, holding all else equal, spent something like 30% or 50% more in retirement. And again, that's just it doesn't really, in some ways, matter if the insurance, if they actually did have that event or not, if they had some kind of long-term care event, it's just the presence of the insurance. It's that peace of mind value. And obviously interesting to us as well, that the value of having an annuity in your portfolio, we found using this data set from the University of Michigan, showed the same thing. If you held an annuity, you actually spent more. So to your question, the self-insurance appears to be an aspect of why people are holding on to their assets. They're holding on to it to protect against some event. But in any other walk of life, we'd insure those things, those low probability, high impact events, and basically be able to better enjoy yourself in the meantime.
Yeah, I think I saw in the numbers that only 8% withdraw from their retirement savings on a regular basis, and most people are withdrawing just as they feel they need it, for whatever the cost, might be, that new cost might be. So how does age play into this? Are there age groups that you're looking at? And how does age affect people's spending habits?
Yeah, the rate of spending of assets, we didn't find had material differences. And I should, by the way, caveat that all of this research was generally on folks who were probably in the upper 50th percentiles of affluence. So of course there is a major crisis in the United States around folks who have not saved enough for retirement, and when they get there are largely living off of Social Security and any other source of guaranteed source they have. So all of this research was really on the folks who had accumulated some amount of savings in retirement.
Right.
But we didn't notice any material difference in terms of that stat you quoted, which is like how many were spending down. But there is a well-documented phenomenon that a number of folks have referred to as the spending smile, the idea that if you look at nominal spending in retirement, it starts highest, and then it begins to decline over time with sort of your inability to travel, to move around, to take that vacation, et cetera. And then it sort of ticks up back at the end as a result of perhaps late in life, health costs, et cetera. So there is sort of a natural pattern to spending. which, by the way, also is at odds with the 4% rule, which basically says you take the same amount and adjust it for inflation every year. So even that is another example of, perhaps our models for figuring out what are optimal strategies is disconnected with, how people are actually behaving.
And you had some interesting terms in regard to behavioral tendencies of folks. I'd like to ask you about a few of those because
Sure.
very interesting. And I think from an advisor's point of view, just understanding how the consumer is thinking is very
Yep.
valuable. So what's loss aversion and how does that impact behavior?
Yeah, so I mentioned this just very briefly earlier, but and I should say many of these behavioral, what we consider to be biases, are in some ways our speculation on what is driving some of this behavior. And so loss aversion is basically the idea that you're thinking more about the bad outcomes that might happen. Now, there's a whole mountains of research on behavioral economics. There's luminaries in this area who've demonstrated that people exhibit this behavior. The idea that a gain is only the benefit you get out of a gain is only half what the equivalent losses. Like people don't like losses more than they like gains. And if you apply that to retirement, there's been research that's demonstrated that loss aversion is even more material in retirement. Basically, once you've saved and you don't have an additional sort of labor income coming in, you're so anchored to holding on to that principal you've saved that it makes you very, very averse to seeing, the balance drop or the loss come down. And again, there's been research that showed that that's even more true than someone who is, say, 30 or 40 or 50 saving for retirement.
Which I guess makes a lot of sense. You can understand that fear.
Absolutely.
Also, what's mental accounting and how does that impact things?
Yeah. So mental accounting is basically the idea of putting things into buckets. And I think the idea here, again, it ties to um, we saw in our research, there was a lot of tendency to, if there was a steady stream of income coming in, people would spend it. And so, a good example of this is you can think of, two different stocks or two different mutual funds, one that spits off a lot of dividends, one that gets its returns through capital gains. The research indicated that despite the fact that economically those are basically the same thing. Now there's some tax treatments, although I think the dividends are probably worse. The mental accounting is saying that if I get this recurring dividend over time, I feel comfortable spending that. So if I get this quarterly dividend or monthly dividend, and the data showed this, that people who own stocks and got dividends that came into them would spend those to a greater degree than the folks who had had a greater percentage of their earnings on their stock coming through capital gains, which again, economically makes no sense, but it's like mental accounting. Like if I see this thing coming in, I'll spend it. In fact, I think there's been it's one of we talk a little bit about some of the opportunities that advisors have to try to get their clients to actually spend more when they safely can. And one of them may actually be tilting folks into stocks that provide dividends or, interest-bearing accounts that gives people this idea that they're getting this steady stream of income, even though, of course, dividends are not guaranteed for any length of time.
That makes a lot of sense as well. Then there was something called the familiarity bias. So tell me about that.
Yeah, this is, I think, this is the one I attribute to my story with my grandmother. I think it's this idea that what we talked about earlier, there's so much complexity around retirement planning. And people who have been saving all their lives, like, as you save all the way through retirement, your basic rule is to make sure you don't spend more than you bring in. If you do that, you'll put money aside, your retirement nest egg, all else equal, will grow. And I think that there is a challenge as you move, whether retirement is a big step function or whether it happens gradually. Either way, it's difficult, I think, for folks to actually all of a sudden go from you've been saving for the last 30 or 35 or 40 years to all of a sudden you have to do the opposite. And that familiarity bias is, again, following that simple rule of don't spend more than you bring in because you've been doing that for the last 35 years.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly can understand that. We get into patterns and rhythms, and it's hard to break those after a while.
Yeah.
Finally, what's the endowment effect?
Yeah. And I might lump this in with the behavioral concept of anchoring. It's basically the idea that once you've achieved a certain level of wealth, it becomes very important to you to hold on to that. And you actually do see that in the data as well. So we mentioned, most retirees say their number one goal is to, live comfortably in retirement. Leaving a bequest shows up just basically dead last. But something else that scores relatively well is this concept of preserving my level of wealth. Now, of course, that's pretty at odds with the first one, which is problematic. If you want to spend more, you may have to have your level of wealth go down. But this endowment effect or this anchoring is the idea that, hey, I saved, Voya have these commercials like to my number is X. When you get to your number, you never want to see your balance drop below that number. And I think that's the concept we're highlighting. It's not rational in any real way, but it's a number you can sort of fixate on as something that you feel good about. And I think that's leading to some of this behavior, this idea of preserving a certain level of wealth.
So what can an advisor do to help people through this, to educate them a bit more, help them feel more comfortable, living more comfortably, essentially, in their retirement?
Yeah, no, so it's a great question. And this is what the point of our paper was probably two things. The first was, and my first recommendation as I've gone out and talked to advisors on this topic is we need to develop plans for consumers based on how they actually live, not and how they actually behave, not how we assume they're going to live. And I mentioned this when I spoke with you guys in the summer. I referenced we had this interesting stat that with all this sort of panic selling and moving out of stocks and into fixed income, the assumption that many models make that people buy and hold is just plain not correct. Like people don't buy and hold. We should just stop assuming that. We should start assuming that people actually do buy and sell out of stocks, no matter how many academics say it's a bad idea, they do it. So that's a point. Like, let's not start every retirement planning conversation assuming people are going to spend at 4% and increase it by inflation year after year after year. We need to design plans based on how people are going to behave, and we need to talk to our clients and the end consumer about how they actually intend to behave in retirement. So I think that's one main takeaway. The other is this idea of the value of guarantees or the value of repetitiveness. Again, we're the leading seller of plain old single premium immediate annuities in the industry. Put in a lump sum of money and get a stream of income for life. You can view that contract as a zero-sum bet with the insurance company. If I live a long time, I win. If I don't, the insurance company wins. And I think that's fundamentally flawed, and this research shows why. The value of that guarantee in the person's portfolio is peace of mind. They know that they can live to 110 and the insurance company is going to pay them off. In the same way that I've got peace of mind that if my house burns down, I've got some insurer that's going to make me whole. And so what that means is that peace of mind, which to me, 5 years ago felt very fluffy. I'm a quantitative guy by background. Peace of mind is kind of amorphous. But this research shows that peace of mind actually does something. It actually changes people's behavior. And so I think the lesson for advisors is if folks are exhibiting behavior that implies that they're self-insuring against risks, we should evaluate whether it makes more sense to actually insure that risk or to bear the cost of that self-insurance, which in many cases is essentially underspending. So it's really a question of like, how are people actually behaving and adjusting plans for that? And then looking at the value of guarantees, which in many cases can actually change, retirees' behavior in positive ways.
So obviously another big shadow on the horizon for a lot of people is long-term care. And so that would fall into the same bucket. If people were prepared for it, there are some states that are looking at providing it because it's going to be and it is such a big issue. Certainly there are many products out there, but that would be part of the self-insuring versus insuring equation as well, correct?
That's right. And I think the data in this paper demonstrated, the Seabreeze study mentioned, demonstrated a huge, probably the largest benefit of any of the sort of guarantees we mentioned was from long-term care. And I think that makes sense. It is it meets that definition of low probability, extremely high impact event that,
Right.
insurance is fundamentally designed to cover. And you can certainly self-insure against it. It's just very, very, expensive in terms of like the amount of money that you have to hold on to over time. Um, and so, I'm not an expert on, the variety of different types of long-term care insurance, and I certainly won't make recommendations in that area, but I think it's important that advisors are considering basically what's the cost of not having it. It's not just the cost of buying long-term care insurance, but it's the cost of not having it and what that's going to do to, a retiree's ability to spend down their assets.
Right. And I think in addition to the products that they can present that give people comfort, it's also, a bit of education about this, and to maybe take the numbers and really talk about their lives first and then the numbers second.
I think that's exactly right. And again, I think that there's other, what I would consider to be behavioral tricks. I mentioned that point on, dividend heavy stocks versus
Right.
those that accumulate more. Again,
Yeah.
I think that's economically, it's sort of the same thing. But if it gets folks to spend down and the advisor is quite confident that the individual has enough money, they've run all the numbers, rather than trying to convince them with, Monte Carlo simulation, which the vast majority of people, glaze over at the even concept of. Advisor can go run that in the background and say, one suggestion here might be that you can, spend a little more as a result of converting some of your savings into income producing vehicles. And I think that's a little bit of a behavioral trick to sort of overcome some of this.
Right. So I think this has been very valuable. I think the advisors who see this and learn more about this will really help them get inside the head of their client and really understand the behavioral guidance that you folks are shining a light on here. So I think this has been very helpful and will be great for our readers. So I appreciate it very much.
Wonderful. Well, I enjoyed the conversation, John. They're great questions, and thank you.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it. And I'm sure we'll be talking again. Thanks very much.